Hello there. Glad that you can be with me today. I'm Steve Cole, the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Oswego, Kansas, as well as the West Mineral Methodist Church in West Mineral, Kansas. And we're glad that you can be with us today. We're looking at a little story about faith from about the life of Abraham, and looking at it from the perspective of Romans chapter 4, verses 18 to 25. Hoping against hope, he, being Abraham, believed that he would become the father of many nations, according to what was said, "So numerous shall your descendants be." He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in faith, and he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. Therefore his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now the words "it was reckoned to him" were written not for his sake alone, but also for ours. It will be reckoned for us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was handed over to death for our trespasses and was raised for our justification. May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his word. You know, as we progress through life, we go through various different stages in life as we're growing up. When we're young, we can't wait to do certain things. We can't wait for them to happen, and sometimes the time seems to go too slowly. At first, we're not able to walk, and we try, and about the time we're a year old, we finally make it there to walk, and it seems like we just can't wait to get there. And then when we're a little bit older, I can remember I had two older brothers, and they both went off to school, and I had to stay home. I wanted to go to school. I couldn't wait till I could go to school like my brothers did. And then they got bicycles, and I had a tricycle. I couldn't wait until I could have a bicycle too. I wanted to be able to do what they did. And of course, then later, as they got older, they had motorcycles. Oh, I couldn't wait until that time came that I had a motorcycle, or they started to drive, and yet I wasn't old enough to drive a car yet. And yeah, eventually I got there too. We keep wanting to do those things. And both of my brothers would, during the summer, as they got older, would help my grandpa on the farm. Well, my brothers got to do that. They each had their turn, and I couldn't wait. I wanted to be able to help grandpa on the farm too. Well, eventually I got there. I got to be able to do that. So then, they both played football. I wanted to play football, and those things took place. One of my brothers went off to community college for a couple of years, and when I got out of high school, I too went off to college as well. So yeah, and of course they both got married, and eventually I got married too, and they had children, and eventually we had children too. So these things happen, but we look forward to certain things happening in our life, and we to get that first job, and to get a promotion, and get our first house, and have our own, the children, and eventually move up in our jobs, and we have certain things we like to do, go certain places, and it might seem like it's difficult to go because we don't have the time or the money. But eventually, things work out, and eventually we someday think, well, someday I'm going to retire, right? And eventually we get there. That happened to me a couple of years ago, at least partially retired anyway. And we also had something I did one of these days, after several years of living in church parsonages, we knew that we were going to retire someday. We said, well, we wanted to have a house of our own. Well, we made plans for that, and yeah, it did come about. A couple of years ago, we were able to move into our own house. So, and I've had something on my bucket list for the last several years that I wanted to go see the Grand Canyon. Well, in a week or so, I'll be doing that. I'll be finally doing something I've been planning on doing for a long time. Now, it gets us back to our story about Abraham. And I'm sure that Abraham and Sarah had plans for what they were going to do with their life and the different things that they were going to accomplish. And one of those was probably to have children. And, for a Jewish couple, that's a major thing, to have children, to pass on because Abraham had a fair amount of livestock and other goods, but he didn't have any offspring to pass it on to. And God finally, I'm sure that he and Sarah prayed again and again and again. Finally, when he is 75 years old, finally, God came to him and said, Abraham, you're going to be the father of a great nation. Your children will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Abraham's 75 years old. His wife Sarah is 65 years old. Really? But Abraham believed God. The thing is, it didn't happen right away. You see, Sarah is 65, and we think, well, that sounded, but then again, I looked in the Guinness Book of World Records and saw that there was a record of the oldest woman to give birth by natural means was 59 years old. 65 isn't that much older. Maybe, just maybe, it might be possible that somebody at 65 could have a child. And a man 75 certainly father a child. So it's highly unlikely, but not impossible, right? That's when God first came to Abraham. The problem is it didn't happen right away. And over the years, as years went by, God kept coming back to Abraham and saying, I'm going to fulfill the promise. You're going to be the father of a great nation. Sarah is going to have a child. He married this other gal named Hagar, had a child with her. And God said, no, not through Hagar. It's going to be through Sarah. Well, God finally comes again when Abraham is 99 years old. And again, 3 men come and they say, by this time next year, Sarah will have a child. What did Sarah do? She overheard what was said. She laughed. She thought it was funny. How am I going to, an old woman like me, have a child? Well, it says she laughed. Well, what was the name of the child when it did come? When it was born? Isaac. What does Isaac mean? Laughter. God has a sense of humor, doesn't he? Oh, gosh. The thing is God didn't give Abraham and Sarah a child when it was very, very unlikely to happen. He waited until it was totally impossible. When Abraham is 100 and she is 90. But Abraham didn't waver in his faith. He believed God. He believed God was going to do what he said he was going to do. That was part of the promise. The other part of the promise was, he said he would have a child, but the other part, he would be a father of a great nation. Well, by the time Abraham does finally die, he gets to see his son, possibly his grandchildren, and that's about it. He doesn't really get to see, doesn't possess the land that they were in yet. And they said that they would possess all this land. It took several hundred years before the people of Israel finally went into the promised land. Wow. And yet Abraham believed God. We were told that Abraham, it didn't weaken his faith and considered his own body was good as dead. Well, we see another kind of rebirth that takes place. They were kind of a rebirth for Abraham and Sarah. And we fast forward several hundred years to Jesus. And he meets with a man named Nicodemus. And he tells him something else about not really humanly possible. He says, you must be born again. How can you be born again? And, of course, Nicodemus says, can you crawl back into your mother's womb and be reborn? Of course, Jesus wasn't talking about a physical rebirth. He's talking about something spiritual. Wow. But it was because of faith. We can be reborn again by faith. As Jesus said, whoever believes in me shall not perish but have everlasting life. Now the passage in Romans says, now the words it was reckoned to him were written not for his sake alone, but for also for us. It is reckoned to us who believe in him, who raised Jesus from the dead, who handed him over to death for our trespasses and raised for our justification. Yeah. You know the song we sing, great is thy faithfulness. God's timing isn't always our timing. But if God promises us something, it will come. We just have to have faith. The third verse says, pardon for sin and a peace that endureth, thine own dear presence to cheer and to guide, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow, blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. Tells us the promises that God gives us, the pardon of sin, forgiveness for what we have done wrong, and a peace that endures, a peace that surpasses all understanding. And as Psalm 23 says, even though we go through the valley of the shadow of death, we will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Strength for today. Get us through whatever life will bring, and the hope for the future. There's an old song called Count Your Blessings. Sometimes we need to count our blessings and remember what God has done for us. And most people at 75 with a wife that's 65 would have lost all hope that they would ever have a child, but Abraham continued to have faith. Jesus told us that we only have to have the faith of a mustard seed and we can move mountains. Now, those mountains might not be literal mountains, but things that we think are impossible, God can make possible. But I did see a place where a mountain was moved. In Colorado, there was a mining company that wanted to mine the gold and the silver that were in this one certain mountain. But instead of digging into the mountain, which is the normal way it's done, they took the whole mountain apart. There was a mountain on one side of the road, there was a valley on the other side, and they moved the whole mountain, took out the silver and the gold and other precious metals that were there, and then moved everything to the other side and built another mountain on the other side, and there became a valley where a mountain had been with a lake. Maybe we can move mountains. The thing is, never said how long it was going to take. It wasn't going to happen immediately. It took several years for them to do that. We look at people who have done over the years and we think those things are impossible. Well, one time we thought, when this newfangled thing came along called the automobile, said, they'll never replace the horse. But it did, right? Yep. When computers came along, they're fine and good for businesses and for educational purposes, but there'll never be a need for people to have them in their homes. Yet most of us have a computer in their home, and when cell phones came along, they were a novelty. Nobody would need one of those things for their everyday life. Yet practically all of us have cell phones now. And we wonder, how did we ever get along without them? Yep. Yes, there are things that we thought wouldn't be. But somewhere along the way, someone had faith that these things would work and come about, and did what they could. We didn't think we'd ever be able to put a man on the moon, but we did. Think someday maybe we'll make it to Mars. Well, yeah, we probably will. Yep, that will probably happen someday. And now we kind of wonder about the things in our own lives, and especially in the church. There are some that say, well, the church is just slowly dying, and eventually one day, there won't be any churches left. Well, we'll have to wait and see. But there was a time in this country, back before it was the United States, back when we were just colonies in America. When the first people came, some came for religious freedom and wanted to practice their faith, but some came for other reasons and weren't necessarily all that spiritual or religious. And church wasn't really, there really weren't all that many churches, and there weren't all that many people going to church when the early days of the colonies in America. And then something happened. Something called the Great Awakening. That some of the preachers started preaching some sermons that we don't know exactly how it happened, but people like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards and some of the followers of John Wesley who brought this thing called Methodism to America. And people started listening. And they started changing their lives. And they started getting involved. And they started having faith in God. And there was we might call a revival in America. And they started sending out these, especially with the Methodists, started sending out these people called circuit riders that went out and established churches in all these little towns all over the place. And some of those even came here to Kansas and started churches here as well. Some people might have thought at the time, there's no way the church is dying. There's no future for the church. And yet the church came back because some people had faith. And that's what God calls us to do. He calls us to have faith. That we don't know what the future might bring, but He calls us to be faithful and to serve and to praise and do that and let God do the rest. Well, Abraham and Sarah had to wait 25 years for God to fulfill His promise to them. God's timing is not always our timing. We don't know. We just will have to have faith that God will accomplish the things that want to be accomplished. Well, thank you for coming. And just remember that God is with us to guide us, help us, and lead us today and every day. Amen.